The Formula One cost cap. Some love it, some hate it, and others forget that it even exists. 2 years after being implemented into Formula One, we've started to see its impact on the grid, but is it fair for everyone? The cost cap is an overall positive for the sport. It will make the sport better given time, but it isn't perfect and still needs to be adapted to allow for the best racing and most exciting championship battles to happen. I just feel like teams that have been on the grid longer and have been able to spend more money for longer on top of that still have an advantage which needs to be balanced over time. Let me explain. The cost cap was introduced back in 2021. It put a restriction on what the teams could actually spend on their cars. So any expenditure related to the car's parts, elements to run the car, team personnel, garage equipment, transport costs, that was all covered by this cost cap. And the focus was to restrict car development costs. So the teams had to focus on what was being developed and try and restrict a little bit of what they were spending on each of the individual parts. However, James Vowles, who's trying to lead Williams towards this new era of Formula One success, has found a fundamental flaw in the cost cap regulations in that the money for capital expenditure, so what the teams can spend on new machines and infrastructure inside of their factories, is actually pretty similar for all teams, but all the teams aren't working off of the same foundations. I mean, James has a clear comparison because he worked at Mercedes since they joined in Formula One, and before that he was at Brawn and Honda and BAR, so he's seen how Mercedes have come in and built this incredible facility that they have, and Mercedes have spent between $350 and $450 million every single year on their car, but also on the facilities behind the scenes. So basically, the Mercedes factory is as state-of-the-art as possible. They have the best of everything, the best wind tunnel, the best carbon fiber manufacturing, the best data analytics that you can possibly get. Whereas when James came to Williams and stepped into the Grove-based facility, he remarked how it was like stepping back in time by 20 years, and that Williams doesn't have any of those facilities. They were in survival mode over the last few seasons, and until Doralton came in recently, they just didn't have the money. Williams only spent around 150 million per year, so 200 or 300 million less than Mercedes every single season. And it's not just Mercedes, but Ferrari and Red Bull have been doing the same thing, spending hundreds of millions more than the other teams. So the big teams now have that expenditure locked in. They have that baked into the facilities behind the scenes. But it's not just Williams on the other side of this. Haas, AlphaTauri, Alfa Romeo all had similar spends to Williams between 2016 and 2019, just before the cost cap came in, where they were spending 200 to 300 million less than those big teams. And the cars are more competitive thanks to the new regulations, but the factories are still way behind. Now, I'm not saying this is an easy fix by any stretch of the imagination. It's so difficult to regulate factories in the same way that we regulate cars. And Vowles has pointed out that Williams have to spend more of their cost cap on infrastructure than the other teams just to try and play catch up. But they're also spending more per part because they have to outsource a lot of their parts because they can't do it in-house like Mercedes, Ferrari and Red Bull can. So the bigger teams continue spending money on the car and they stay ahead of the field. I think the best example of this is Aston Martin losing out in the development battle over the course of this season. They started with the second fastest car but haven't been able to keep up with the upgrades of the other teams. There are other factors at play, of course. You still need creative people in your team to develop the car and a culture to help them thrive, but the infrastructure systems are still a very important part of that. And I think Aston Martin fundamentally for me couldn't have kept up with Ferrari and Mercedes because their factory is still under construction, where Mercedes have the most state-of-the-art facility available to them all year round. I feel like the cost cap therefore has to be adapted a little bit to help the smaller teams catch up without killing the bigger teams. There's almost two sides to the cost cap. First, the operational side, the car, that stays the same, covers the manufacturer and the on-track action. I think that has worked incredibly well. We've seen the cars get closer and closer together under these regulations. But the second, the capital expenditure side, the factories and the machines, I just think has to be adapted. I think this second capital expenditure side, when it's adapted, it could be something similar to what we have with R&D and wind tunnel time. Like, look at this, the lower in the championship you come, the more wind tunnel time you get. How about the lower in the championship you come, the more money you get, but solely for infrastructure, not the car itself, but for tools and factories and facilities. So like first place has to hit the cost cap as it is, and then maybe 10th place, they get an additional 20 million to spend on their factory. Obviously, the number isn't important there. It was just the way of that being implemented, I think is already there for us. So of course, this would need quite a lot of regulation. The team's already put together reports for the current cost cap, but now they'd be drawing a line between operational costs and infrastructure costs, and where that line is drawn would be very difficult to judge and important to get right. But I just feel like it's the only way we get a competitive championship where a new team can actually break into that established top three and stay there. We have to remember it's 2008 with Lewis Hamilton in a McLaren was the last time we saw a non-Red Bull or Mercedes world champion. The only way that we can have that again is if the other teams have the same base to build off of. I think we're seeing on track now, the cars get closer and closer together with these regulations, but off track, I still think it needs a little bit of work. And for a true meritocracy of racing to be there without just becoming a spec series like IndyCar, for instance, we still want to have Formula One as it is. And at the end of the day, it's about the entertainment. The sport only works if people want to watch it, and people won't want to watch it if there's only really 3 teams that can ever actually win a world championship. More drivers would be in the fight for wins, more teams would be closer in the constructor standings, and the new regulations are great and definitely working. Max Verstappen is just an absolute god right now, but they can get better, and I feel like the cost cap regulations do need to change just a little bit. But I'd love to know what you think. Let me know in the comments down below. How do you think Formula One can get past this infrastructure problem? And if you enjoyed this video, I actually put together another video on the future of Sergio Perez. So click that link and I'll see you over there.